All right, welcome to another episode of the Credder Podcast. I'm your host, Chase Palmieri, and with me today is Eve Pearlman. Eve is the co-founder and CEO of Spaceship Media and a strong advocate for dialogue journalism and the speaker for the TED Talk, How to Lead a Conversation Between People Who Disagree. Eve, thanks for being here.
I'm so glad to be here.
Great. So Spaceship Media has been and continues to be at the forefront of this issue around one of these big issues facing our democracy and our personal relationships, which is the polarization of society that keeps getting worse and worse. And we're having an increasingly difficult time having conversations across the political divide. Most people, me included, have friends or family members that they struggle to talk to sometimes because of the political divide. And your organization brings people together in real life and through kind of Facebook groups and other social media aspects, but you try to bring people in real life and to discuss these issues that are some of the most contentious issues facing us today. So to get started, why don't you list off some of these issues that you've helped moderate?
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that nice intro and knowing what we're up to. Our Spaceship Media was launched in 2016 with this idea of how can journalists go to the heart of divides, to places of conflict and tension, like we always have, right? But then once there, do something different, to invite nuance, to invite a coming together, to invite reflection, right? So instead of engaging the most practiced partisan voices, to think about ordinary people talking about the issues that matter to us as a society. And we're driven by many things, but one of them is this idea that without being able to even talk about really important issues, we stop functioning as a democracy. And that was clear to us 4 years ago when we started, and it's become even clearer now. So you asked what kind of topics we've talked about, and really we've worked on most of the most polarizing issues in our society. So we've had conversations that engage race and racism. We had a big project where we talked about guns and gun safety. We hosted a conversation about immigration. We've talked about farming and food and sustainability. We've pivoted around just electoral division. So we've mostly all those deeply polarizing topics we've worked to engage.
And one of those topics that I was researching was this California and Alabama discussion, where you start things off by having the people from Alabama list the stereotypes that they think Californians see them as, and vice versa, Californians saying how they think Alabamans, is that how you would say it? Alabamians,
yeah.
Think of Californians. So can you start by explaining what the Alabamans, sorry for people in Alabama listening to the podcast, what they thought Californians thought of them and what on the other side?
Yeah, so in all of our conversations, we don't just say, here, get together and talk. We do a lot of work at the front to invite the kind of connection that we're looking for. So we ask people if they want to be a part of a respectful conversation, right? And a lot of people don't, but some people do. And then to start off every conversation, we ask a series of 4 questions. You alluded to one of them, which is we ask people what they think the other side, and we're obviously going to polarization points and then teasing nuance. But we frame those initial questions very binarily in a binary way. So we ask people what they think the other side thinks about them, and then what they think about the other side. And we do that. Those are 2 of our 4 starting questions. The other 2 are what do you want to know and what do you want them to know about you. But those 2 questions that invite people to think about the stereotypes and negative ideas they hold, say a Biden voter might think about someone who votes for Trump and vice versa, to think about them, surface them, and then also think about how the other side thinks about them, surface that. And then people begin to see that those stereotypes can't all be true. Like every Trump voter can't be X. In the project you're alluding to, every Clinton voter can't be Y. And so we surface those as a way to invite people to look at those things and then begin to move beyond them. And so you asked specifically about those stereotypes that and I think, which side did you just ask about?
I'd like to hear about both, actually.
Yeah, so so that project you're alluding to, we did right after Trump's election in 2016, and it ran between the election and the inauguration. And we gathered a group of women from the San Francisco Bay Area who wanted to be a part of this, and the Clinton supporters, and then a group of women from Alabama who had voted for Trump. And the things that they said about each other were, striking and also painful, and also then revelatory. So Trump voters have these stereotypes of Bay Areans, like self-indulgent, not concerned about their kids, like hedonistic, pie in the sky intellectuals, bleeding hearts. So they carry this wealth of stereotypes about the Bay Areans. And then the Bay Areans, think that the Trump supporters are like, religious, conservative, inflexible, racist, sexist, all of that stuff. And so when you surface those, they can't be true in the extreme. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so you bring them together for a conversation. And I know that you also have journalists you're a journalist, but you also have journalists helping moderate these discussions. What is the role of the journalist in these discussions?
Yeah, so, I come at this work as a journalist, right? And what the driving impulse for me as a journalist is to both inform and hold community, like reflect society and community back to itself, and also to give people the information they need. So for us, the role of moderators in our project is lots of things, but it's primarily twofold. One is to support this respectful, fact-based discussion, right? And that means doing all this legwork that we do at the front, inviting people in, guiding them towards self-reflection, laying out the ground rules, the structure of what this is and what it isn't, helping people kind of move from the reflexive, ugly, reactive way we tend to have around these issues into softer, more open, more curious spaces. And so our journalists play a role in that moderation, which is not always a comfortable role for journalists, right? Who many times kind of hold themselves separate from the community. And then the other piece of this work, which is how we're different than some of the other groups doing bridging work. There's so many right now, so many organizations working so hard to figure out and work towards a more united country, is that we infuse reporting into our conversations. So when people are talking about something and say it's a divided community, right? They're talking about legislative history of gun regulation in the United States. And it's then that our reporting comes into play. So we can actually provide a foundation, a shared set of facts for people to talk about it. So it's not just that back and forth sniping, but hey, here's some actual information. What we find is that after people have come into conversation with each other and also with us as journalists, that they begin to trust our reporting. And we do it in this very transparent, open way with the idea of saying, look, this is a role we can play. We're pretty good at finding information. We're pretty good at contextualizing information. We're pretty good about clarifying information with the power of language. Here's our offering to you. And so we weave conversation and information together. And because we come at these interlinked problems, right, of decline in trust in journalism, polarization, and then kind of this global dehumanization of the other.
Yeah, and when we met, it was back in 2016, when you were founding Spaceship Media with your co-founder, Jeremy Hay, and I was co-founding Credder. It was in the lead up to what we knew was going to be a very contested political election. And you were really focused on this issue of the declining trust in media, but with a little bit more focus on how to kind of bridge the divide and have these powerful conversations. And we obviously focused more on the trust in media angle. And then we haven't talked much since then, but we were talking a lot more in those early days when we were figuring out like how to solve these problems. How do you think that the situation in the United States, this political divide, is different, worse, better than it was when you had the inspiration to start the project in 2016?
It's so interesting. It's these last, what are we in, 11 months of 10 months of not being out and about and talking to people, which is what I love to do, have left me with not the same kind of feeling of having like a pulse of what's happening. But I don't think that anyone like a kind of an organic feeling about it. But look, we are, I can't remember the stats off my head, but we have X% of the population that believes this election was stolen. We have Y% who can't believe that someone would believe it was stolen. It's ugly out there, right? And I've been thinking more as time has gone on about this issue of, and I'm just diving into this because this is sort of a spot of curiosity for me, is where is this? I dance around this point of bringing people together with a respect for all of what people, ideas and views people are holding. And then also, where is the line that I can help draw around misinformation, right? And specifically thinking, for example, about COVID, right? Like, COVID exists. It is, we don't know a lot about the disease trajectory, but we know that we don't know everything, and that in some cases it's quite destructive, right? And yet, so where is that line between bringing people together, respecting and holding, and drawing lines around mis and disinformation? And I don't mean to throw you a curveball, but that's, I think if we're talking about how the landscape has shifted, what we saw the glimpses of in 2016, like, that really surfaced into the mainstream of mis and disinformation and sort of barrage of all kinds of, new news in quotation marks outlets, and real attacks on the integrity of sort of the structure, the traditional structures of journalism and media, we see amplified now, right? And we see it hardened and difficult. And I talk to people, and I do get to talk to people sometimes, who are just so deeply and profoundly overwhelmed. Like, who to trust? What can I believe? And I lately, and how do I find my grounding when I'm just inundated with all kinds of contradictory, confusing, slick presentation of information and misinformation? And so I think it's a difficult and tough time. I think that the core things remain, which is like slowing down, grounding ourselves in our humanity, taking a breath, like stepping aside from the noise of all of this stuff, and really thinking slowly and carefully and in relationship to one another. That was a long winding answer, so see where you want to go with that.
We love long winding answers here. Two big, hotly politicized issues just in this last year. One of them you mentioned, which was the election stolen, this issue of voter fraud. And the other was the politicization of mask wearing. Have you at Spaceship Media had any conversations structured around those two topics?
Yeah, I actually, right at the start of the pandemic, I wrote a proposal for a COVID conversation. And then I just, because of like my personal life and all sorts of things, I didn't go and seek funding, but we just got funding for it. And so starting in January, we're going to host a series of what will be one-on-one conversations between family members who are on, for lack of a better term, opposite sides. And the reason we're doing it, and it probably won't be about COVID so much, it's probably about vaccines at this point, but we're doing it that way because the pressures are so profound that we want to start with the caring and concern that family brings, to remind us that, like, it's really hard for us to remember that some abstract, Democrat or abstract Republican is human, but it's easier for us to remember that our uncle, our niece is human. And so we're going to do these very small, closed series of conversations about probably about vaccines. So yeah, we haven't had a formal conversation. Now it comes up in all of our groups, right? And that's what the line I was talking about earlier is, like, that hard no on blatant just lies, right? Thinking about where we draw clear lines. And there's a lot of critique in journalism of both sidism. And so the dance that Spaceship does is saying, we're all human, we're all concerned, we all want a better life for ourselves, and some things are just lies. Like, so that's the kind of the threading the needle and that holding that contradictory thing. And I talk to kind of left-leaning people who are in this moment. A lot of people are like, why do I have to talk to anyone who's on the right? They want me dead. They don't care about me. They are not interested in me. And I'm always encouraging people to hold that a separate, kind of to challenge that idea in themselves. Like, not all Trump supporters are X. In fact, you know many of them, and they come to those beliefs and situations through a lot of experiences. I'll leave it there for you.
So let's take one of these examples. So you're talking about a conversation between two family members that maybe one person from Spaceship Media sits in and helps moderate. Sounds almost like family therapy in a way. And I guess in some ways, you know, having discussions across these political divides is therapeutic, and then that's what it's supposed to be. But what is the role of the journalist? Are you fact-checking people in real time? Because I could imagine that would make it contentious, and just like a therapy session, you don't want to look like you're taking one side or the other, because that could make it worse. How does that work?
Yeah, so it's all about pacing and timing, right? First of all, look, if facts were enough, we wouldn't be where we are, right? Like, we have tons of great journalism in this country. We have learned, for example, in 11 months, a whole lot about this pandemic. We know a lot about how this virus is transmitted. We know a lot about how it can be treated. Like, we have a lot of great reporting. The problem is that facts aren't nearly enough. And in fact, barraging people with facts is often counterproductive, right? You're familiar with confirmation bias. So giving people information, they can't receive it if they're predisposed not to trust you. And in fact, it'll make their belief stronger. So yes, we draw a lot on psychology and sociology, thinking about how opinions are formed, how relationships are formed, how minds are changed. So I just want to emphasize that, like, if information were enough, and you know this because of your work, you'd be smooth sailing, right? I would say, look, if you're inside a closed space with someone who has COVID, you have, for this amount of time, these are your odds of contacting it. That's why a mask makes sense, or ventilation makes sense. We know that, but we can't believe that unless we have a relationship with someone. So I think about this a lot. Like, if journalism were working, we wouldn't be so catastrophically fucked. So we have to rethink what we're doing. We have to look at the psychology of information and how people receive it, and how minds are made and how connection is made. We have to look at how we are tribal. So to answer your question, we always think about relationships coming before trust. So, and if you think about your regular life, that, you know, that's true. You don't just walk into a meeting or something and lead with your heaviest point. You talk, you get to know someone, you connect with them, you're in relationship with them, and then comes everything else. And so in every project we do, we front load the relationship, right? And so when we're going to bring people together, we'll ask them those questions. We'll talk specifically about the topic areas. So probably will be a one-on-one conversation between the journalist and each participant. There'll be a structure to that conversation where people have space to talk, where they have space to be curious. We will remind people how to come forth and really listen. Really listening is very freaking hard. And because we tend to be rehearsing our point, we tend to be getting tightened up because someone said something we don't believe in. We tend to tune out. And so all of those things we work on, like how to listen without just crafting a response. And our conversations are not a debate. They're genuinely driving towards conversation where you're like, hey, why do you think that? Hey, that confuses me. Hey, I've always wondered this, or I read all this stuff, but I also wonder this, like kind of getting to those places of softness. So yes, it's not the traditional role of journalists, but simply giving information isn't working.
Yeah, and you mentioned being kind of a student of how minds are changed. Is there a formula that you know of that you follow in these conversations, kind of a step-by-step thing? Can you speak to how minds are changed?
Well, I want to be really clear. We think of our work, and our work does live at the point of just bringing people to the table, the metaphorical table. Like, it's not, because when you say mind's changing, everybody always assumes, like, if you and I disagree about X, if I'm talking to you, I'm thinking it's your mind that should change, not my mind that should change. So we don't live in that place. We live in the place of, let's not reflexively and habitually dismiss and malign and disparage anyone who's got a view different than you, right? And so so you asked about formula. We know that minds don't change when you insult someone, when you malign them, when you shame them, when you name call them. I always find it super interesting that people know that in their personal lives, they know that but then they get in the political sphere and they're like, I'm just going to tell them they're an idiot, and here's an article with with some facts that refutes that. Doesn't work. So I would say this, for us, we're driving towards the humanization and the breaking of just that, living in these sort of tribal, ugly, dismissive pots. And we're working to help people see how their behavior in their own in-group can be really destructive, right? Like, it's hard not to get angry, and it's hard not to sink into name calling, like the great orange one, the blah, blah, but the belief for Spaceship is that it doesn't help, right? We're going to get out of this through recognizing our shared fate and recognizing our shared humanity, not by being giant jerks. It's strategic and it's wise.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You made me just think of something, which is that it's true. In real life, we know that name calling and not listening or trying to empathize or understand a problem from somebody else's side makes solving that problem impossible, and it's very unproductive. And I think you're right that when it moves into the political sphere, it's almost like it's rewarded nowadays that, oh, I don't even know any, let's take the classic, liberal in California. I don't even know any Trump supporters. I see all these posts on Facebook. If you're a Trump supporter, unfriend me now. I have nothing left to say to you. And it seems so unproductive, because what you should be doing is, if you actually care about the issues and you care about creating a consensus around the issues you care about, you would want to build a coalition. You would want to reach out across the political divide and speak to them even more and understand their situation even more, so that you can frame your argument from their perspective and bring them into the fold. And we see this in politics now, where it's like when you see a Democratic senator, for example, what's happening with Bernie Sanders right now, he's working with a Republican to try to add some things to the stimulus bill, and immediately all the other Democrats, and as well as kind of the Democratic voting base, is shaming him for working with a Republican. But it's like, don't you understand that politics it works this way? If you work with somebody on the other side of the aisle, you have a much better chance of getting your thing passed. So it's almost like it's become a badge of honor that you're an all-in tribalist. Can you speak to that at all? Am I wrong, or is this really happening, that now people are proud of how tribalist they are?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if that they're proud of it, or that they just are stuck, and, people are frustrated and in pain and confused. And so when you're those things, you tend to cling to certainty more, right? Like, honestly, I grew up in the 70s, in a very kind of optimistic, hopeful time. The world that we're in now, how divided, how unkind, how ugly sort of our news and information and our social square is shocking to me. And one reaction to that is to hunker down and vilify. I think the real path out is to recognize that in ourselves and work to fight it. I think that change and social movement forward comes from that bigness of empathy, that bigness of love, if I may, and that inclusiveness, that recognition of our shared humanity, our shared fate, our shared goals. And this is remarkable country. I mean, you think about the richness of our society, and so much talent and so much drive and so many people coming from all over the world. And I think we need to remind ourselves of that story of ourselves, like the melting pot, the opportunity. I mean, it is wildly imperfect and founded on a system of slavery that will always plague us as we reckon with it increasingly, but reminding ourselves of that positive story. So I think it's like we fall into that tribalism, but we can lift ourselves out of that. And I think a lot, my mom always said, perfect is the enemy of the good, comma, Evie. But like this idea that we've forgotten that democracy requires compromise, that we don't get it all the way we want it, that we are a society that is wrestling with tremendous changes in a very narrow period of time, and having some empathy and consideration for people who maybe don't see it exactly the way you do, and is incredibly important. So I just think people are stuck and we don't know what to do. And so one of the things we do with our work, and lots of other organizations that are doing, is calling people to remember, like, we are, not to get biblical, but we're our brother's keeper or our sister's keeper. We have that within us. And there's lots of, difficult things about the American character that have been highlighted by COVID when you look at how other countries manage a thing that needs collective action to reply to it. But there's also lots of beautiful things. So it's a long way of saying, like, one of the things we ask people to do is to come in as their better, best selves, to fight that urge to be like, fuck them, and to instead say, oh, right, they care about their family, their friends, their country, their better life. And there's real hardship, right? And real difficulty. I mean, when you look at the economic possibilities for people, it's very difficult. So I'll leave it there for you.
So what is one of the most contentious conversations that you've been a part of? What topic?
I don't think about it as topics so much, because I really see them as all people are struggling to find their bearings. So I see it like that. I sort of see them, but I think that the most difficult conversations that I've worked with people on are when somehow people have managed to get through our sort of screening introduction process, but really have no interest in discovery. And that's the hardest, because one of the things that I like about our work is not everybody is going to come and have a conversation. Like, lots of people aren't ready, or they feel too threatened, or they feel too angry, or whatever. And so the real conversation, the real struggle, is when people aren't really interested in hearing. But most people we engage with are working on that edge. Like, what am I missing? What don't I see? How come my mom is like this? Or how come this person is like that? And then those struggles are just, that is the work. Like, how do I understand that this person could legitimately come to this point of view and be a good person? They could feel this way and still be a loving human. So that said, I think any topic that's really tied to someone's identity is hard, which most of these things are at this point. So no particular topic area, sorry.
No worries. And obviously what you try to do is bring people together in real life. We're talking here through Zoom, even though we're kind of like 45-minute drive away from each other, and it would have been great to catch up in real life. And I'm sure the pandemic has affected Spaceship Media. So how have you guys adjusted throughout this?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of conversations online, as well as in person. And actually that first big conversation that you referred to, the Alabama-California conversation, we launched that and we didn't know where the platform was going to be. We just kind of were like, okay, we know this is something we want to do. And we ended up conducting that on Facebook. So not in person, right? And And I really think of myself as platform agnostic. Like, I believe in meeting people where they are. And so that conversation was on Facebook because most of the people that we were engaging with were on Facebook. We could have done it on any other digital platform. We didn't have budget to bring people physically together for a period of time. So I think there's a lot to be said for digital communication. For me, as like an introvert and a writery person, I've had some of the best, most intimate, most real conversations like by text. Because for me, it sheds some of the other noise of being with someone. It's not to say I don't really like being in the room with someone. That's great conversation. So I'm not wedded to any platform. And obviously now we're doing a whole bunch of things on Zoom like we are. I think part of why things go so ugly online is that there's just no guardrails. We have, and so I'm going to give you an anecdote. We did this conversation around immigration in, I think, 2017 in California, and it was sort of framed kind of looking at Trump's policies right then. And we don't usually have to remove people from a group. This conversation was on Facebook, but in this conversation, what I learned something that I should have learned earlier is that there were a couple of people in this conversation that were just push at the limits of the guardrails, the rules, until they were until they were stopped by an exterior force. So one of the ways we moderate is, if we're on Facebook, is to have one-on-one messenger chats. And what I learned from that is that there were some segment of the population that had just learned to go until an outside authority stopped them. And so there wasn't this like self-regulation of like, I'm being a jerk, I should stop now. It was like, I'm going to push this as far as I can. And I think if you look at the early days of comment regulation on newspapers, you see that, like, there was kind of our free speech ideas and wanting to cultivate conversation. I think we didn't stop ugliness soon enough in comments and newspapers. But what was interesting to me is just people push until they hit an exterior wall. But I think that doesn't mean that you can't create really great spaces online for people. And people are doing it all over, especially now, right? Because we don't have what we used to have. So this is a very long answer, Chase, to I don't privilege offline over online. And in some ways, online can create for some people incredible richness. For other people, they need to be in the room. And then this is a really heartbreaking time, right? Because they can't be. But lots of people can do beautiful things. Be very intimate, be very real, be very authentic, be very open through text or through video.
Yeah, I think most people who would look at Spaceship Media would assume that you're not using a platform like Facebook. They'd be like, oh, okay, they're probably position their values, and it's probably in their mission statement that get off of Facebook, delete your account. So it's funny that you're using these mediums and you're not saying that they are the problem. You're saying that we have a problem and we need to try to create the environment for better conversations. And you're still saying that that can be done online.
Yeah, I mean, look, Facebook is, when we started this, I kept thinking, look, we're using Facebook, the site of so much ugliness, to do something really different, to say that this platform can be used in different ways. I think, I don't want to get into it, but what the lack of responsibility at the highest levels of Facebook, I think you probably saw there were some more high level people leaving last week. It is very clear to me that what is on Facebook is profoundly destructive, and what is allowed and what has been allowed to persist. And I spend a fair amount of time perusing conservative groups, and I'm still shocked at some of the stuff I see, which I report all the time as a hobby. One of the things that Spaceship will do in the coming years is create its own platform that allows for reporting and engagement. And I've looked at, and there's lots and lots of people who've made platforms, but I haven't found the one yet that I want to build on, but we'll either build on one or make our own, because I think the relationship between conversation and news or information needs to be rebuilt. And I think, to your point, yeah, Facebook is tough. It pains me to be a part of it, but it's also where people are still. And engaging people where they are is really important, because people do not want another login or another, do you need another login?
Yeah, sometimes I look at social media, things like Facebook and Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, and I just think of them as pipes. I don't think of them as necessarily anything other than just pipes and channels that people can talk or connect through. Yeah, they each have different types of channels, Twitter with their character limit, but they're basically pipes, and that sometimes we blame these platforms for the nastiness, but it's really just us being nasty inside of their pipes. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that? Is the problem really with us, and we're blaming these platforms because they're helping us see in real time and right in front of our faces how nasty and divisive we can be?
I think it's both. I mean, we just worked with ASU News Collab on a group that was tied to their media active, so a media literacy training, and then we created a Facebook group adjacent to that called Help Is This True, to help people vet news and information and explore misinformation. So we were having a conversation about how to parse and synthesize and assess all the stuff that's coming at people. And in that group, I saw the Facebook algorithms working against us, because it was this very measured, slow, thoughtful conversation with people who mostly agree that mis and disinformation are problems and who are trying to navigate it. And the way Facebook elevates stuff is that it elevates conflict. I don't know if you saw a bit ago, there was a story about how Facebook's own internal group about issues in Facebook, they found that it was amplifying the most strident voices, and it was getting really contentious there, right? And I don't know enough about how the algorithms work, but I can tell from my user experience that it amplifies the ugly. That's what gets surfaced in your feed. That's what the more quick, the more judgmental. And so where am I going with this? I think we can blame the platforms a lot. I think Facebook in particular has made, at the highest level, has resisted internal pushes, and there's some good coverage of this, especially in the Wall Street Journal, about how they have resisted making some of the changes that would help moderate this. But yes, ultimately, if we can begin to hold to our best selves, then we can navigate these spaces better, right? Like I hold myself to even higher standards in social platforms than I do talking to someone. And that's how they raise this generation of kids. Like I have 2 young adults, and they hold themselves to higher standards because they know it's out there. So it's a combination. It's platform and it's people. Yeah. And I think platform can, I was going to make an alliterative statement, but it seems silly. Platform can polarize.
So just to stick with this for another minute or two, I don't want to defend Facebook, but let me play devil's advocate for a second.
Yeah.
I think Facebook would say, it's sticking with this idea that they are the pipes and that we are the problem, and we now have a way of reflecting back at us how divisive we can be. If they're just the pipes and they are a platform that is just trying to optimize for engagement and time on site, which is pretty much what all of these platforms are doing, and they see that humans engage more and stay on the site more and do more on the site when they see shocking and outrageous content, aren't they just giving us what we want? Isn't the data bearing out that we want these types of things, that we're attracted to it? On some level, isn't the problem that we keep clicking and reading these things?
Yeah, so humans are fascinating, right? And we're I don't know, if I have chocolate cake in my kitchen and I have to walk by it and not have it, like every time I go into the kitchen, like let's see if I can tie this point together. Like that's like sugar is a drug for a human being. And we rubberneck because that's what humans do. We go towards point, like journalists, right? We go towards shiny objects, we go to points of strife. So, I mean, you get into this discussion a lot around food, right? Like in this, I don't see if I can draw this parallel. Like if I go to the store and there's it's filled with sugary processed foods and the produce is only around the edge and the fresh meat is around the edge, whose responsibility, right? And you see movements against that, like soda taxes and talking about getting good foods into poor neighborhoods. And so if humans were just sort of enlightened actors, that might be it's our fault, but we're not. We're biological entities that are driven by the need to survive and so I don't think that they're just pipes. If these platforms were just pipes, it would be a different thing, because like when I first started using Facebook in 2010, I ran a local news site and I shared an article I'd written. It just appeared in people's feeds, right? I didn't have to game the system. I didn't have to tell people to like it. I didn't have to pay for advertising. And so the algorithm is designed to exploit, the algorithms are designed to exploit, I think, our most base drives. So they're not neutral at all. And for that reason, I think there's a profound responsibility that we are only beginning to think about how to manage. And hopefully we can and will. So if things were surfaced in a one-to-one, if the picture of, if the most thoughtful, reflective, measured discussions were amplified the way the most heated, nasty things were, that would be different. If the platforms weren't rife with just blatant lies, and if there weren't so many freaking non-real actors on them. I mean, the number of fake profiles is just on any platform is just extraordinary. So I don't know where I've landed, except for that I don't think they're neutral. I do think we can act against them. Facebook is super addictive. I have so many friends who've been like, I'm going to be off, I'm quitting in a month, and then they're back on. Or I'm never going to post again, and then they're back on. Or I deleted my profile, but then I undeleted. I mean, it's super addictive, right?
Yeah.
So more addictive than chocolate cake, I would argue.
So we're basically saying then that yes, it's human nature that is attracting us to these types of behaviors, these types of things, but we think that these platforms have a responsibility to try to, let humans be their best versions of themselves when on the platforms. And I think that there's a real argument to be had there. I think these platforms are responsible for trying to create positive change in the world, but it's interesting that we have to acknowledge, but it's really our fault, but we want them to kind of play the moderator in some way. And you use the example of a grocery store, and I think that that's super interesting. I actually hadn't thought of that before, but it's totally relevant, because you're right. When you go into a grocery store, you've got your main aisles right there where you've got your cereals and your processed foods and all these things, and the healthy food is kind of out on the edge. Now, the grocer is probably thinking, oh, this is me offering up convenience, because what you guys keep buying is these processed foods and sugary things. So I'm putting it right there so that you don't have to walk all the way around the store. I'm offering you convenience.
Well, I think it's more I think it's more calculated than that. And I don't know enough about grocery stores. And when we finish, I'm going to go look. But I think that brands pay for placement and they pay for location. And so, you know, and so there, it's actually there's financial dealings behind that. Right. And so, yeah, it's not simply as neutral as that. I don't think. Look, I think about life in the US in many ways is a constant need to resist some of the noise from advertisers, from sort of from the norms of our kind of consumer culture. And I don't know how we got on this, but like, it's hard to resist those things, and it's hard to resist Facebook. I mean, I know a lot of people have deleted Facebook from their phones just because they find themselves continuing to go to it again and again and again. And so, yeah, I mean, sometimes we deal with what's in front of us, humans mostly, right? We are worked on by our environment. So how can we improve things is a little bit, what is that environment?
I think that that's a great point. It's like, why am I seeing the frosted flakes here at the eye level spot in the, you know, right in the middle of the cereal aisle? And we don't see those kind of back end dealings. And I think a lot of the issues with social media and the news feeds is, why am I seeing what I'm seeing? Why am I doing that? Is this because an advertiser paid for this placement? Is it because this is somebody I followed? Is it because it's somebody you want me to follow? So I do think you're right. I think more clarity in why we're seeing what we're seeing would help. And just to kind of end this point, because I want to move on to other things, but you're right. Facebook is addicting. These platforms are addicting. My last, and again, I'm not defending these platforms.
No.
By no means I'm defending these platforms, but I do think there's a lot more nuance than what the mainstream conversations are. I think that a lot of this is that we are addicted, not necessarily to Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, but to each other. I think that people are addicted to people. I think we are addicted to connection and keeping up to date with our friends and seeing, that new picture that your brother put out of your baby niece. We're addicted to each other, and that's not a problem, but these platforms are definitely taking advantage of that. So moving on to a next topic though, is we have Christmas coming around the corner. It's holiday season. Yes, it's a pandemic, but likely a lot of people are going to be talking to family members that they haven't seen in a while.
Yeah.
What's like your little piece of advice for somebody who's about to go into a lunch or a dinner or just a Zoom call with that crazy uncle or that, that person that they already know that they disagree with on basically everything? What's your little bit of advice for that person?
Yeah, I would say before you get on that call or get ready to go outside and sit outside, is take a big breath and remember sort of the affection you have for that person, the kindness you have for them, the love, the history. And then I do think of this, these conversations with family as being a process. I like the idea of planting seeds. The first seed I tend to plant is just to listen. Because a lot of people just have a lot to get out. And so even if it's hard and hurtful or confusing, I really think about orienting yourself to be able to hear someone, because a lot of people really just don't ever get to talk. And I'm not saying, and I think this act takes a little bit of talking, reminding yourself not to take it personally. I think we so often fall into wait, he said that and that means, but to sort of suspend yourself a little so that you're giving yourself a little protection from something that might be hard for you to hear, but to really let people talk, because we without telling them they're wrong, and without, and I think, and showing vulnerability is also helpful. So like if someone says something that's hurtful, like they say something that they don't know is offensive, you can say, hey, just so you know that, you can be vulnerable if you can, but really listening, I think, is a really good starting point, and coming with, not to harp on this, but love and affection, and having a little bit of distance from it all. Like, we can be so caught up in that's super counterproductive. So like stepping back, breathing, listening, not thinking you're going to change their mind, not thinking you're going to convince them you're right, not telling them they're stupid. Start there. And that's a seed, right?
Yeah, no, I love that. That's great advice. Okay, so let's get to the last two questions I ask every guest that comes on the podcast. But before I do, why don't you give listeners a couple links or destinations they should go to follow your work?
Well, our website is just spaceshipmedia.org. You can see a lot of stories about our work there. You mentioned the TED Talk. You can just Google TED Talk. I in that talk, I was trying to explain as concisely as possible our process. And I'm pretty psyched it's only 9.5 minutes. So I think that's a good introduction to it. And we have a book just came out about guns, An American Conversation. It was one project, and that book maps how that project unfolded and explains our method. So it's a real deep dive. It's about guns, so there's a lot of information about guns specifically, but it also explains the arc of our work.
What's the name of that book?
It's called Guns, An American Conversation.
Right.
And it's on the internet.
Okay. Yeah, it's on the internet. And just for listeners, that TED Talk is called How to Lead a Conversation Between People Who Disagree. All right. So Eve, last two questions for you here. Question number one is Bitcoin. Are you a believer or not so much? Or have you ever heard of it?
No, I have trouble with money as an abstraction anyway. Like, I mean, I get that, like, I'm drinking coffee and that has value to me, but the fact that I paid something that's abstract to buy the coffee confuses me. So I'm not very good with money anyway. So Bitcoin is entirely confusing to me. Like, okay. I've tried to read about it. I don't get it. But again, I don't actually get money. Like, it's too abstract for me. So that Bitcoin stood no chance.
Yeah, that's totally fair, because Bitcoin is really, it starts with a conversation of what is money. And that's actually a much harder debate than I think most people realize.
Yeah, I don't get money.
Okay. And last question for you here is, are we living in a simulation? Yes or no?
So I don't even know what a simulation is, except for that my son read sci-fi for a while. So I think maybe when I read some of those with him. No, look, I do think it's interesting that I think a lot about how we can't see outside ourselves, right? And I think about this in terms of, objectivity, or being a journalist and storytelling. Like, I can only see what I see. Like, I am only a product of my own experience. I am only, if I look around here, my house right now, there's what I take in and what I don't is very incomplete. And so in the sense that we make our reality, I would argue maybe we're in a simulation. But is in terms of, like, is this all just a non-thing? I'm not interested in that so much. But I am interested in how little we know. And our work, Spaceship's work, hinges on the edges of that, inviting people to explore what they don't know, what they don't see, what isn't abundantly obvious. And now I'm plugging Spaceship, but that's where the magic happens, right? When you're like, oh, maybe I don't know everything about issue X. Maybe there are legitimate ways to think about this that aren't the way I see it. So that's the edge of the simulation, I guess. I don't know.
Okay, great. Well, Eve, thank you for joining me. It was great catching up with you again. We'll have to not go so long this next time. And I hope listeners go and follow your work and try to participate in some of these conversation groups, and just participate in conversation more generally in your daily life. Like, everybody has that uncle or aunt or cousin or brother, and they probably would still love to hear from you. And if you decide that, like you said, you're going to come at that conversation with a little bit of distance and not trying to change someone's mind, but try to just listen, you'd be shocked at how receptive people are to listening to you after you've listened to them. So I love that you're out there doing this. We try to do our little part of this in a very specific way on Credder, but you guys are, all in. You guys are finding the most difficult topics to have a conversation about today, and you guys dive right into that political divide. And I'm glad there are people like you out there doing that. So Eve, thank you again for what you're doing, and thanks for coming on today.
It was really fun. Thanks, Chase.